Good evening. Leaving the EU with a deal by the end of October is now looking extremely unlikely, according to Downing Street, and talks are close to breaking down. The claim follows what was described as a challenging phone call between Boris Johnson and Angela Merkel this morning, in which the German chancellor apparently said a deal was unlikely unless Northern Ireland remained in the customs union. There was an angry response from Brussels as the EU's top official, Donald Tusk, warned Boris Johnson not to become engaged in what he called a stupid blame game. The Prime Minister is now due to meet the Irish Premier, Leo Varadkar, later in the week for crunch talks. Our political editor, Laura Kunsberg, reports.
Hugs and smiles outside the door. The Prime Minister greets the President of the EU Parliament.
President Sassoli, is a deal still possible?
Another one of the continental politicians he has to convince. But is there a point to all this now? Of course, Boris Johnson claims.
Prime Minister, is it over?
After 45 minutes of talks, though, the awkward truth? There's been no progress to getting a deal, Signor Sassoli's conclusion. So,
ci sono due alternative a un accordo in questo momento, l'estensione o nessun accordo.
There are two alternatives now, an extension or leaving without a deal. Still publicly, ministers are hurrying to try.
Of course, there'll be bumps in the road in the path to a deal, but I'm confident that the fair and reasonable offer that we've put forward will elicit from our European friends progress in the days ahead.
But early this morning, before the cabinet arrived,
The Brexit talks on the brink of collapse.
the Prime Minister spoke to Angela Merkel for half an hour. Number 10 sources told me her conclusion and theirs. A deal this month was almost impossible.
Have we reached the end of the road when getting a deal?
Unless the EU got Northern Ireland to stay in the customs union, and that has always been ruled out by this administration. With customary formality, Germany would not confirm the contents of the call.
Der Austritt Großbritanniens aus der Europäischen Union, das wird
But with no change in position, the chances of a deal now seem almost gone. Then the EU's top official jumped into their hostilities, accusing Boris Johnson of getting into a stupid blame game. What's at stake is the future of Europe and the UK, as well as the security and interests of our people, Donald Tusk wrote.
Forget the he said, she said. In a way, it's a simple standoff. Boris Johnson wants a different deal with the EU that would mean different customs systems on either side of the Irish border. But the EU believes that's not realistic without serious disruption, so saying no. And that means it's extremely unlikely an agreement can be reached in time for the UK to leave the EU with a deal at the end of this month.
Tonight, the Taoiseach told Irish TV he and Boris Johnson agreed they would keep trying for a deal. But
I think it's going to be very difficult to secure an agreement by next week, quite frankly. Essentially, what the United Kingdom has done is repudiated the deal that we negotiated in good faith with Prime Minister May's government over 2 years, and have sort of put half of that now back on the table and are saying that's a concession. And of course it isn't.
And it's not truly over until it's really over. The UK's negotiator David Frost swept into Brussels today for more talks.
Why are you here, Mr Frost? Have the talks almost collapsed?
Despite the opposition's scepticism, it could ever really happen.
Government put proposals on the table that were never going to work. They were designed to fail. And instead of reacting and changing their proposals, they're now collapsing the talks and engaging in a reckless blame game.
Parliament packed up for a week tonight, suspended again before the government puts its plans for the country forward in a Queen's speech next Monday. Hard to tell tonight what the plans for Brexit will look like by then. Laura Kunsberg, BBC News, Westminster.
Preparations are continuing for a no-deal Brexit, and today the Cabinet Minister in charge of that, Michael Gove, said that even with every possible preparation in place, risks and challenges for businesses still remain. Today, the think tank for the Institute for Fiscal Studies issued a stark warning about the impact of a no-deal Brexit on the economy, predicting that national debt would rise to levels not seen since the 1960s. This could lead to future governments imposing more spending cuts, raising taxes, or both. Our economics editor Faisal Islam reports.
As the Brexit deal looks increasingly logjammed, the planning for and consequences of a no-deal Brexit and its immediate impact on trade up and down the country matter more than ever. The government has not updated its numbers, but the likes of the Institute for Fiscal Studies has.
The IFS predicts that the public finances will be heavily impacted by a no-deal Brexit, that the annual level of borrowing, the deficit, will double over 2 years, approaching £100 billion, and that the total stock, our national debt, that would reach the highest level it's been for over half a century.
I think if we had no deal, the economy would grow very little, if at all, over the next 2 or 3 years. Borrowing would rise up towards 90, 100 billion pounds a year, which is a very significant increase on where we are. And if that happened, I think we'd have to have another period of either tax increases or spending cuts to get it back under control.
So why is that? The expert economists behind this report say that no deal will impact our trade with Europe and lead to a smaller economy compared with Brexit being reversed, for example, a gap of over 4% that could be mostly eliminated if there was still a deal.
Here's an example of why exporting fish to markets in the European Union would require far more red tape, customs and vets health checks, confirmed in the government's published latest no-deal preparation documents, the minister in charge praising the efforts of business.
Of course, risks remain, and challenges for some businesses cannot be entirely mitigated, even with every possible preparation in place. But the UK economy is in a much better position to meet those risks and challenges thanks to the efforts of these sectors and companies and my right honourable friend, the Chancellor.
That's not what many farmers are saying after the government decided to prioritise cheaper consumer prices of products such as imported eggs. It didn't offer protection for the domestic poultry industry when it confirmed plans for post-no-deal taxes on trade or tariffs. Of concern for a government preparing for an election, the farming lobby said it felt betrayed.
Well, ultimately, history shows you what it means. You know, if you import cheap raw ingredients that are produced to lower standards, we just downsize our production, we export our production abroad, and we take in cheap imports, in many cases that would be illegal for our farmers to produce to here.
The latest numbers show that the economy in general is becoming less productive after a slump in business investment that many blame on the prospect of no deal and prolonged political uncertainty. As the tide goes out on negotiations, British businesses are still left searching for answers. Faisal Islam, BBC News.
Well, let's get the latest now from our political editor Laura Kuhnsberg and our Europe editor Katya Adler in Brussels. Katya, you can sense the frustration in Brussels. From an EU perspective, do they feel that these talks have reached a dead end?
Well, Sophie, no and yes. I mean, very little is straightforward when it comes to this Brexit process. If we take that all-important step back, EU leaders still want a deal, and they believe that Boris Johnson still wants a deal, although they're not convinced just how high up his list of priorities getting a deal with the EU comes, compared, for example, to winning a general election. But in the meantime, they say they're still open for talks, including this week. They haven't entirely ruled out the possibility of finding a deal by the end of this month. But realistically speaking, Boris Johnson's proposals on how to replace the Irish backstop are problematic for the EU. Not completely, not the whole offer, but when it comes down to customs. Boris Johnson insists Northern Ireland must stay in the United Kingdom's customs territory after Brexit, but that leaves the EU with two choices. Either have customs infrastructure on the island of Ireland, and Dublin says that's a no-no, or the EU doesn't control its own customs border. It says that's impossible. What about food safety, it says, in the single market? But, Sophie, this isn't the end of the road for the EU because they're looking more long-term. They think a new Brexit extension is the most likely outcome here, giving more time for talks. But no one here is starry-eyed that I talk to about the idea of more time. Of course, you still need to find an accord between the EU and the UK acceptable to the European Parliament and the UK Parliament as well. And, of course, no one knows exactly what that accord will look like, neither now nor in 2 or 3 months' time.
So, Laura, it is all clearly hanging in the balance, and if these talks don't work, what then?
Well,
Well, Sophie, it's hard to tell as ever whether or not today's extraordinary twists and turns have been, a firework that briefly lights up the sky and people freeze in horror and say, what's going on here? Or whether indeed they've been some kind of diplomatic explosion that wipes out the idea that there will be any progress in the coming weeks. As Cassia was suggesting, it's not impossible that there could be some kind of resolution. But on the current path, it does look vanishingly unlikely. And that means, therefore, in all likelihood, we are looking at a situation where the Prime Minister is forced to ask the EU for a delay, for an extension, but for a delay and an extension that he does not want. We know that Parliament will try everything to block him taking us out of the European Union without a deal. They've changed the law to try to make it impossible for him to do so. But we also know, and it's always been completely clear with this administration, that number one on the Prime Minister's list is trying to get us out of the European Union at the end of this month. Whatever the wisdom of the promise that he made in his leadership campaign, that is the vow that he wants to try to keep above all else. So if this all fails, we can expect in the immediate aftermath of the European summit a legal and political screaming match that goes on for a number of days before either Boris Johnson is forced to get that delay and then we probably tip very quickly into a general election, or somehow by hook or by crook he achieves what looks very, very difficult, but what he still wants to do is take us out of the EU at the end of this month. But at the moment it looks like in any way we are heading for a period that may well be even more turbulent than what we've lived through in recent weeks.
Laura, Katya, thank you.